A very good afternoon to you and welcome to our budget preview for 2018. I'm Godfrey Mutizwa. Of course, today, all eyes are in Cape Town. And it's not about the drought, it's about the economic health of South Africa. Ahead of that, I think all of you would have heard buzzwords including fiscal consolidation, budget deficit, and some people are saying there's something inevitable this year: increased taxes. Those are some good questions that we'll try to answer today. Let me introduce the people who are going to be answering the very difficult questions that South Africa faces. I'll begin immediately. On my left, Professor Jannie, Rossouw, head of the School of Economic and Business Science at Wits University. I was going to say good evening. I usually work at night. Good afternoon and welcome.
Good afternoon, Godfrey, and good afternoon to the listeners.
And next to him is Annabel Bishop, Chief Economist at Investec. Annabel, good to see you again.
Thank you.
Welcome. Professor Cyril Mbatha is with the University Graduate School of Business Leadership. Thank you, sir.
Good afternoon.
And last but not least, Ettiene Retief. He is the chairman of the National Tax Committee at the South African Institute for Professional Accountants. Ettiene, welcome. Annabel, unlike South Africans, we are gender sensitive. So I'm going to start with you.
Okay.
And I want to begin with a broad question. What kind of budget do you think the economy of South Africa, in the state it is now, requires?
I think we need a budget which obviously does improve the fiscal outlook. So we do need fiscal consolidation. And by that I mean we certainly need to spend less in terms of what was previously projected. And also the borrowings as well are far too high. And that obviously has raised a lot of concerns for the credit rating agencies. And of course we are obviously at risk of a downgrade now coming up from Moody's. But I think on the revenue front, we certainly need to increase revenue somewhat, but not to the extent to make up the shortfall, to make up the deficit. In other words, it's got to be in partnership with lower expenditure and lower borrowings. And I think the key area there is we don't want to see tax increases strangle off economic growth. Remember, it's very recently we've been at 0% in 2016.
Sure.
We don't want to return there. So I think from that perspective, the rating agencies will watch as well that there should be some hope of our economy recovering because of this weak growth outlook they're also worried about.
Sure. That's the easier part. The more difficult question is, what kind of budget do you think we will get?
Look, I certainly think we're probably going to see some attempt at reducing this expenditure. If not the levels, then certainly the growth rate that expenditure has proceeded at. You know, if you look since perhaps 2008, 2009, we've had a massive upswell in debt. Net debt as a percentage of GDP has risen from 18% to 43%. You know, and that's extreme growth. And of course, we've seen contingent liabilities, the guarantees offered to the parastatals, the SOEs, that's tripled in size. And of course, our fiscal deficit, well, it's moved from a surplus right down, you know, to what's worryingly potentially 4.3% for this year. So from that perspective, we're going to see those pulled in. I believe the fiscal deficit probably will come out closer to 4% this year. Yeah. I think the medium-term expenditure framework, the following 3 years, will probably see it aimed down towards 3 to 2.5%, possibly on the back of stronger growth projections, but also, of course, as well, we could see improved tax efficiency and collections through an improvement of SARS performance, as we saw in the early years of democracy in South Africa. We managed to wind back our budget deficit.
Sure. We're going to come back and talk about the Zuma effect as well as the Cyril Ramaphosa effect. Prof, if I can come to you, it's exactly the same two questions that I'm going to ask you. What kind of budget does this economy need right now, and what do you think we will get?
In short, Godfrey, we need a budget that will make sure that South Africa does not face a fiscal cliff.
Aha.
The fiscal cliff.
There's my word.
The fiscal cliff.
Explain
is, the research that I've done with Fani Joubert and Adele Breitenbach of Unisa's economics department, in terms of which we calculate the point where the three main expenditure items of the government will account for all government revenue. And the three major expenditure items are civil service remuneration, social grant expenditure, and interest on government debt.
Sure. And
this has increased over the past 10 years from a ratio of 55% of total government revenue to the current ratio of 72.5% of current revenue. So what we need to see in this budget is how to address the pressing problem of civil service remuneration growth on the one side, and on the other side, how the government will get tax together to make its books balance. So as part of this, I have to stress that the government is expecting from everybody in South Africa to pay more taxes. As a quid pro quo, South Africans expect the government to spend less on wastage and the likes. So I have a long wish list of what the government can announce to reduce expenditure. For instance, only buy vehicles manufactured in South Africa for the government vehicle fleet. There's no reason why politicians must be carted around in expensive imported vehicles that can be transported proudly South African.
They should be driving in Fortunas, right?
Or Toyota Corollas or other vehicles made in South Africa. So there are clear places where the government can cut expenditure. And what I also want to see in this budget is definite spending cuts, not general announcements that we will save 25 billion over the next 3 years. On this item, we will spend this much. It's the quid pro quo of asking South Africans to pay more tax.
Sure. I think I'm going to advocate that you become the next finance minister. Cyril, let me see if you're going to put up as strong an argument for what we should see in this budget. What do you expect, though, before we talk about what we should get from your side?
So I would think that there should be alignment between ANC policies coming out of December. There should be some alignment between what is going to be presented with what was presented by the President last week. I would be surprised if those sentiments that were presented by President Ramaphosa do not translate themselves into the budget. I mean, there are key areas that he highlighted as needing attention. I mean, the fiscal policy is not just an economic policy, it also is a social policy. It's also about bringing in stability, expectation of what is to happen based on what has happened in the past. Unless there are events that have occurred, like the downgrade last year, then you can expect major changes. But from my side, looking at what was presented by the former minister, Pravin Gordhan, there were lots of tax increases last year. The only taxes that did not increase were the company taxes as well as VAT. But so on my side, from just looking at how policy should be aligned, political policy and for stability, I would expect that I don't think that I hope that there is no increase in VAT.
Which is why I saved Ettiene for last, because I think of all the line items in that budget, taxes. So I've seen some very scary headlines. I saw something along the lines, tax increases inevitable. Ettiene, from where you sit and watching this budget, what do you think we should get? What do you think is likely we're likely to get?
Well, I think it is inevitable that taxes has to increase, because at this point in time, in order for us, and I have to stress, we can't tax ourselves into prosperity, but where we sit at the moment is, I think it's an unreasonable expectation to think that taxes can't increase. There's a lot of items that are on the wish list, everything from free education to national health. And I think this is the opportunity under some change for us to say, well, let's reprioritize what we can do in the short term and medium term, instead of trying to do all of it, because we just cannot at this point afford to do all of it. There has been a lot of discussion of things such as medical credits, where currently individual taxpayers get a credit, where for that to be sacrificed and pushed towards funding, for instance, national health. But remember that if you're looking at, for instance, the tax collections, the morality of tax comes down to where my taxes are spent, what am I getting in return for my expenditure of tax, and how do you collect my taxes. So at the moment, we're finding that there is a general low morality sense. So when you start saying as well, I'm going to cut certain benefits that you currently have, the very few you still have, but you still have to privately fund medical aid. Because we're not seeing that NHI, for instance, is going to help the average person, but while I still have to fund private medical costs, those are going to be very detrimental kind of situations. So where do we increase? Well, the unpopular place possibly is VAT, but let's be honest, comparatively speaking, we're below average on our rate. yes, there are certain direct incentive or direct methods we can use to offset the impact for the poor in terms of the increase of that. We've already, in the last budget, heard that, for instance, the zero rating of fuel to be taken off on VAT. That on its own probably bring in about 20 billion.
Sure.
But remember that the taxi operator, that's an exempt supply. So there's a VAT you can't claim that's going to pass on to the consumer. That's inevitable. If we increase the VAT rate by 1%, we can probably collect an additional 22 billion.
Sure. So let's do a little poll here. Are we going to get a VAT increase? And I want to get all of your opinion. Let me start with you and then I'll come back on the line.
I think yes.
What quantum?
Between 1 and 1.5%.
1 and 1.5%. We're going to get the answer before the program is out, so I can tell you I'm going to bring the results of that. Cyril?
No, I'd say yes, but it's going to be 0.
Okay. Annabel?
I'm looking for a 1% increase in VAT, and I think, you know, given that our rate is so low compared to internationally, where you often see closer to 18%, it's probably time for us to see an adjustment.
Yeah, I need to be careful with the Prof, because he said the last time that he made a prediction, it actually came true, the 45% increase in that top rate. What are you hoping for, Prof?
I'm hoping for 0, owing to the very...
Is that what you think will happen, though?
No, what I'm hoping for. You asked me what I'm hoping for.
Sorry.
I'm hoping for 0, owing to the fact that VAT impacts very heavily on poor people. I'd rather see the top marginal rate going to 50% this time, after I've asked for 45 the previous time. However, personally, I expect 2%. Why do I expect 2%? If you're going to take the pain and the social unrest that will come from that, do it properly.
Now, if they do 2%...
Don't do it in half measures. And then, before next year's general election, you can drop that by 1 percentage point, and that will give you a good in on the election.
Wow, okay, you should be a political strategist and you should be advising some of these political parties. Now, if that increases by 2 percentage points, that will rake in, I think according to all your calculations, roughly about another 40 billion rand, and largely plug that hole. What about the business people? What do they think? Well, let's find out, because we all know that when you listen to people, people are saying the Ramaphosa presidency is turning South Africa's fortunes around. CNBC Africa reporter Viwa Mtila visited some young entrepreneurs at the Newtown Junction to find out their needs ahead of the budget presentation.
This is where the budget decisions will hit the hardest. This is a workshop in Newtown Junction, downtown Johannesburg, filled with entrepreneurs looking to make their mark. Fashion designer Lukanyi Sokona is one of them. It's been an 8-year fight to get her business off the ground.
In the past 8 years or so, we've gone from a very small business to a medium enterprise, I would say, and we've gotten very little support from government. I know there are SME incubators around, but there hasn't been a lot of, forthcoming support for myself as a young entrepreneur. I've started out, that's why it's taken so long to get where I am. It's because I've done this myself, I've raised the funding, I've made sure that I could support myself. I haven't gotten any additional sort of support from government, and that's how it's been for me.
She doesn't mince her words when it comes to what she wants from South Africa's budget 2018.
And we're hoping that he can come in and support black businesses, black entrepreneurs especially. I'd like him to focus on basic education, because I think that's where the spirit of entrepreneurship can be cultivated. I believe that young people, young kids can actually rather learn to be owners and entrepreneurs of businesses than rely on employment. I mean, we're in a new age, a more digital age, where business can be run from anywhere in the world. You don't necessarily have to have a physical space, and we're hoping that maybe they can embody that in their address, and also focus on empowering young people.
Kona is one of many in this corner of Johannesburg who have opinions about what the new government should do.
The country's just being run by the same person, it's just a different face, That's just my opinion, because as our business, we try to get funding from the government and stuff, and nobody was there to fund us. So all of this happened, like we had to go get jobs, get a day job, which we don't really like. We had to work for somebody until we could come up with the capital to open this shop.
I would want him to, create jobs that will be able people to have extra money to come and buy healthy food and stuff like that, and I want him to tackle economic inequalities and the land issue is very critical. I would like him to address that as well.
So what can we expect this week from South Africa's budget 2018?
I think the time has come for a VAT rate increase, and he's got to find some way of helping the poor to alleviate the burden that they're going to be facing with the increased cost.
With each year's budget, there needs to be consistent focus on how we're going to grow this economy. So I think to some extent, the Minister of Finance needs to get a buy-in from his colleagues.
I think one of the big things here is we do understand that we need to invest in education. So if we can ensure that things like the policies that you put in place are in line with the National Development Plan.
Back in Newtown, the fashion guru has a few last words of advice for South Africa's newly elected president, Cyril Mbatha.
I hope he doesn't only focus on job creation, but also creating entrepreneurs. That's my main passion, I think. But I think as an entrepreneur, it would be great also to involve small businesses in this job creation. We would like to grow, we would like to expand, and we'd like to do a little bit more for our country in terms of providing employment for young people. What we'd like is get into a manufacturing space where we could actually produce our own things. I mean, we can't be relying on Chinese imports or relying on other people to come in and take over our manufacturing space. So I'd like him to focus on manufacturing and education more than anything else.
Macroeconomics are what the budget will be about, but maybe it's a good time for government to remember that it's entrepreneurs like Kona who are the ones who risk their money to create jobs that South Africa so badly needs. Aviwe Mtila for CNBC Africa, Johannesburg.
Thank you, Aviwe. And we're still discussing what the Minister of Finance, who we expect is going to be Malusi Gigaba, will deliver to Parliament today. I saw a few suggestions that he may not be the guy who's delivering, but I don't think anyone would have accepted that poison chalice that certainly the Minister is going to deliver this afternoon. So we were talking about the potential increase for VAT, and I think we got everybody's opinions in. And in addition to that, there are other measures that the Minister can look at in terms of increasing taxes. Can you just begin perhaps, Ettiene, by just outlining quickly what those are, what you expect, and in what areas?
Well, I think first of all, it's unlikely that the top tier or the top rate of 45% to increase
on personal income tax.
Purely because we're probably at the point of where if we increase that, we'll actually encourage more tax avoidance. We might even collect less in revenues. What I think is more likely to happen is a readjustment within the tables, essentially at what tier you get to the next tier of or percentage level, and also the adjustment between that and inflation, which gets that fiscal drag. It's worked well for us in the past. And the other side as well is there's a number of incentives, concessions, allowances, things like that. We've seen in the past where if you want to collect extra taxes, you also go after those and you start reducing some of those or pulling back on those, because that's where there's losses of taxes. So there's probably some avenue for those to come. And then, of course, our usual sin taxes and those to come in as well.
Your alcohol, your tobacco, etc., etc. Cyril, from your perspective, do you see, in terms of some of the big ticket items, for instance, like corporate tax, any move towards perhaps increasing it, or perhaps on the personal income tax, like you're saying, anything that could likely change there, or some kind of a wealth tax?
Well, like I said, last year there were increases in many of those categories except for the company tax. I would not rule out an increase in personal income tax at the maximum, but I think at the top end. I think though that the argument that we need to avoid tax avoidance and evasion practices, and normally that's done at the top end. I think if we are more efficient in collecting the taxes, as we were 10 years, 12 years ago, quite efficient, would be probably not be in this space where we're in now. So besides the tax measures to try and increase the revenues, there are also other methods that were in at SONA that the President talked about. Getting the governance right at SARS, ensuring that there are no leaks in the irrigation system that transfers our water resources. In this sense, I'm using this metaphorically, from the tank, which is the revenue pool, down to the irrigation system itself. So if you close all those leaks, we may be able to actually collect enough water.
Is it possible that the Ramaphosa effect could come into play here? Because tax compliance, as we were discussing earlier, probably has been going down a little bit because people aren't happy about what's going on.
That's definitely.
Will that add something substantial?
Sure, that's definitely definitely on the cards, because people do avoid and evade tax because they don't feel confident about where they're investing their money into, in terms of tax, into which basket they're putting their resources into. So when you feel people, when people feel more confident about the direction that the country is taking, they're more likely morally to agree not to evade tax. And
sounds like we're talking about that Mandela miracle again, all over again. Annabel, from your perspective?
Look, certainly I think, what they're not going to do is increase corporate tax. We're not at the low end internationally there, so I would expect it to stay where it is.
Trump has just done what Trump does.
Well, our issue in South Africa is we desperately need more growth and more employment, and the Davis Tax Commission's been quite clear on that, So I think instead it will probably be focused on the income and potentially the VAT increases, as we've said. I think certainly they could look at estate duties, capital gains tax, other wealth areas as well. There is that expectation going forwards. They'll look to increase taxes on high net worth individuals, and I think that is something which is probably we're going to see increasingly. I think possibly they may look at a 46% increase in the top marginal tax rate of this budget, even though tax buoyancy is so very low, because I think
tax buoyancy?
Looks, and perhaps even before we get there, to offset any increase in the VAT rate. That's what I wanted to say. Okay. If they increase that top tier rate. Look, I think tax buoyancy essentially just translates down to, the more you increase taxes, do you actually get more money, or do you actually start getting less money back into your coffers? Okay. And what that really means is that, at some point people will feel, well, these tax rates are just too high. Either it disincentivizes business and growth, and that actually results in a dip in revenue, or people themselves actually, as we were talking about earlier, start looking at tax avoidance, tax evasion. But essentially looking really at the economy, is the economy itself buoyant enough to actually stomach these tax increases, and that we've all been talking about. And bear in mind that the majority of economic activity in the economy is certainly on the household consumption expenditure side. That's 2/3 of GDP. Certainly it includes the corporate as well. But when you start increasing those tax rates significantly, people start to rationalize how much they're actually working compared to what they're actually getting back at the end of the day, both from government in terms of services and just in terms of their disposable income, their after-tax income.
How much are you guys revising those growth estimates, and to what extent could we take comfort from that, and perhaps maybe think the minister is going to desist and say, let me watch this baby grow, because we are creating the environment that will enable us to create more because the economy is growing?
So I think that's a very good question. The expectation is now under a Cyril Mbatha presidency, certainly if it extends through 2019, he gets 2 full terms after that, would be one of substantially lifted business confidence, which typically then translates through into an improvement in investment and, of course, economic growth and employment. That's certainly the expectation now. We've already seen a lift in the business confidence measures so far this year on his investiture. So I think certainly looking forwards, it would be silly not to revise up your GDP growth forecast in the budget.
Have you revised yours?
Well, let me get to that in a moment. But certainly, for your GDP growth forecasts in terms of National Treasury, if you revise up your current rate for GDP growth, if you rise up your expectation of the actual figures, then you actually see your ratios start to come down, your projected ratios of debt, your projected ratios of the fiscal deficit. So that's an easy way to massage them down somewhat. And the general expectation is we could be looking at a faster economic growth outlook. So certainly, we were looking at economic growth struggling to reach 2%, over a 5-year period, and that's not, a flash in the pan like a drought-led recovery or, a boost from mining sector, but sustained growth. But now we're looking at potentially 3 to 4%, but it's going to be very dependent on these tax increases. If the tax increases are too severe, you'll pull back again. You won't be getting those growth rates that I mentioned. But certainly we've improved our outlook somewhat, but we're judicious. We want to see what Moody's says. We want to see what the outcome of the budget is.
Right. You haven't given me a figure.
Of what?
How much you've revised?
For this year?
Yes.
Okay. Well, look, we were looking at economic growth of close to 1% this year. Possibly it could come out closer to 1.5%. Right. And next year, it was below 2%. It could be above 2% for next year. Sure. And so we move out over the period.
I like it because I'm calling it the Ramaphosa effect. How much is that? 0.5% this year, potentially 1 percentage point next year. Prof, I'm coming to you.
Yes, indeed. Just dealing with the Ramaphosa effect, all South Africans are desperate for good news after the Zuma chaos we had. It was really a dark patch in our history, and we all feel excited about this new leadership. We want this country to be a success. So Mr. Ramaphosa must capitalize on that. Yeah. And of course, part of what we hope to see through a new budget is a clampdown on corruption that will help us to get more money.
Could that add substantially something?
It could add substantially something, but unfortunately it's not a budget item that you can scrap on your savings side. Oh yes, and now we scrap all, corruption. So yes, I, for one, as I've said, foresee higher personal income taxes. I want to remind the panel that we now shudder when we talk about 50% marginal tax rate. The highest marginal tax rate on individuals we ever had in South Africa in the early 1970s was 72%. So we have quite a way to go to get to where we were before, and I sincerely hope we are not heading in that direction. But 50% is high. Of course, it's higher than what we have at the moment. But as recently as around 93, 94, marginal tax rates were indeed at 50% and came down. So
are you seeing this happening this time around?
I will not be surprised to see 50% coming. It will also give a very important sign to poor people that the richer people and the more affluent people in South Africa really carry their burden of the current economic difficulty.
Prof, you're sounding like a socialist.
No, I'm not a socialist, I'm a realist. I once thought of the following. Let's introduce a 60% tax rate on people earning above, say, 5 million a year, on condition that if the economy goes above 2.5% per annum, we drop that as a temporary measure. So all the captains of industry will have an incentive to invest in this country to get growth higher because they will pay less personal income tax. But I must admit, I've not thought through the logics of that to an extent that I can be in a debate this afternoon with a very informed panel.
Well, it's certainly been thrown out there, and certainly the minds will begin to work on it. Gentlemen, do you want to add anything on the Ramaphosa effect or any of the other points raised by the other panelists?
I think one of the things that we mustn't forget, and when we talk about the maximum rate, remember historically we didn't have things like capital gains tax. Right. So what we've seen is over time, and even last year we were surprised by seeing, is that push to increasing the effect of capital gains tax. Yeah. So even when we had the conversation of things like wealth tax, I'm not sure this is the right time for that introduction yet, but what we're more likely to see is the continued attack on things like trusts. So we've already seen now the attack on trusts because they've been synonymous for use for people to avoid their estate duties and to shift their values off into a trust. So we've seen, for instance, the change where we're looking at taxing that loan that is given to offset to get the assets in the trust. Yeah. So if we follow, for instance, the Davis Committee's recommendation, we might see that the next step is to look at removing the conduit effect we have in a trust, where what it does is it flows it through to the beneficiary to be taxed in the beneficiary's hands at many times a lower tax position. We're trying to keep it in the trust, trap it there and tax it there. Now the maximum tax rate at 45% applying to that trust and a far higher capital inclusion means that trusts could become an extremely expensive vehicle and you can't avoid that. So instead of a wealth tax or maybe those other pushes, we might see again trusts being under attack and I think that's where that wealth element and the wealthy will come into it, and that's more likely I think to be seen today than perhaps another form of wealth tax push.
From what you're saying, it sounds like that would be a fair thing to do.
Well, I think that is the logical next step to do, because trusts are synonymous, or unfairly sometimes, but synonymous with tax avoidance and wealth preservation. So that would be the logical step to go.
I'm also hoping that we will have the Ramaphosa effect.
Yes.
But I'm
How big do you think it will be?
But I'll come to that just now, but I'm just worried that without getting the fundamentals of the economy right, we might get people very confident into spending and get consumers into a lot of debt trap, because people are feeling more confident into borrowing, and because now they invested more into the country. So I would hope that the growth that we see is not an artificial growth, but one that is based on actual infrastructure development on the ground, people getting jobs, in terms of real transactions taking place, that's not just from borrowing, because otherwise you're going to have an overheating of the economy. Then we're going to have to come back with interest rates going up to try and cool off our economy. So I am hoping that the increase maybe is a 2%, from 1 to 2%.
Right.
But look, when you have a political climate that is really positive, we can probably even reach 3%.
Hey days. Do you want to add anything?
Yes, sure. Look, I think certainly in terms of, you know, the points you mentioned, it's quite key, you know, the consumer outlook, consumer confidence been depressed for a very long period of time because of the depressed view of the macroeconomic outlook. But I think something to bear in mind, you know, certainly credit conditions in the South African economy haven't been loose, you know, they've actually been fairly tightish. And, you know, consumers have been battling to take on more debt, you know, the taps haven't really been open for them. So I think, you know, that might not be something that changes immediately. You've certainly seen, you know, individuals who've got into trouble with debt escalate quite substantially, and hence,
especially,
you know, obviously
lower income
that's
rates,
correct, you know, and that's why they want to give these, you know, free them from debt. You know, these are the issues that were actually being debated in Parliament. So I suppose, you know, the expenditure we're hoping rather would come on the optimism and investor sentiment front from, you know, the businesses themselves. You know, and really we've seen a quickening of deal activity now in January, and that's been something that's been unusual for us. And, you know, looking
it's early,
forward,
you say.
Yeah, looking forward, hopefully it continues. You know, I think that's certainly the Ramaphosa effect we've been seeing.
Before we leave the tax issue, I wanted us to address just two quick things. I don't know who wants to take it up. The issue of the burden of tax. Are we beginning to talk about the burden of tax in South Africa? Is it an issue that we can talk about? What about the fairness of the system in itself? I think you were talking, I was accusing you of being a socialist earlier. Are we there yet, or does the system need tweaking a little bit? Do you want to take it up?
Well,
you want
in
to take
short, if you look over the past 10 years, the burden of tax carried by the personal income taxpayers as percentage of the total increased substantially. So
it's where the bulk of the government taxes come from, isn't it?
Where the bulk of, it's about 38% of revenue at the moment. So taxpayers really came to the party. It's time for the government to come to the party through better spending planning and less expenditure.
And cuts in expenditure. Annabel?
Yes. Yeah, so I think, you know, that's been a key feature of what we put out for this budget. The Davis Tax Commission themselves indicates very severely that we need to see expenditure cut. And the problem is that they believe it's a cut in the growth rate of expenditure, as opposed to the actual rand amount must be less. You know, and that's the key issue. And I think we can obviously compensate substantially on tax collections through a substantial overhaul and improvement and efficiencies at SARS. I think that will be something where we can garner a lot more people into the tax net. That was the successes that we saw, you know, post 1994, when we worked down that very high fiscal deficit, well above 5%, you know, all the way down into a fiscal surplus. And that trajectory actually engendered in the 2000s South Africa gaining an A-grade credit rating with budget surpluses. And, you know, we've come to believe that we can't have spending on infrastructure in South Africa and fiscal consolidation and tax cuts and all the good things that we've had before. And perhaps now, you know, once we've had this, now that we've had this change in presidency, and once we've seen this translated through into the business sector and faster growth, people realize, well, we can actually do that again. You know, back then we inherited a budget deficit, as I said, well above 5%. Now we're inheriting a budget deficit of possibly 4%, 4.3, and we could still manage to work that down to zero and into, you know, positive territory. But of course, looking at the issues, you know, in terms of how we spread the load of taxation, I think in South Africa, you know, some of the concerns certainly are for the middle income group. That's seen as a bigger tax take area when you perhaps don't give relief for fiscal drag. But the problem is those people, you know, people in the middle income group would worry that they're not getting that much back from government, you know, having to fund their own private sector education, security, all of those areas. So improving government services, and I think that's something that we saw in the sonar. You know, Cyril Mbatha saying they're looking at getting more involved in the private sector, offering provision of government services, not only in future government, you know, a hybrid model. That type of improvement in delivery is something that the countries like Sweden, Norway, they look at that type of hybrid model, and that can deliver a better outcome. So I think we actually need to have a whole holistic review of the way monies are spent, the way monies are collected, but what you get back as a taxpayer, what are you getting back from South Africa, as well as what you can do for those less fortunate than yourself and how we can lift them up further. Because I still am very strongly of the view that unless we get more people into the formal economic net, unless we relieve the burden on social welfare, increase the number of people who are formally employed and who are tax contributors, we're not going to get out of the situation we're in. It can get a lot worse still, and we could still be looking at a fiscal cliff if our economic growth rate doesn't actually lift to the point where our employment rate starts to improve substantially.
Cyril?
So
quickly.
the issue about, I think the attractiveness again of VAT, with lots of people saying that's likely to increase because of administratively it's easy it's like easy pickings, you know.
We don't need government to employ more people to collect it.
Well, it's unlike the other taxes where it's more likely that the burden of the tax could be shifted to other groups that it was not intended to be carried by. But the problem is that it is a regressive tax.
It's a blunt instrument.
So it will definitely affect poor people. But in terms of administrative efficiency, it's very easy to carry it out.
Sure.
So that's the attractiveness.
Let's listen. Oh, you want to come in?
So, I agree. VAT is a very efficient and very effective tax. Its cost of collection is one of the lowest. We have one of the highest compliance rates in terms of it. You also have a very small pool of taxpayers, essentially being the companies making those suppliers, that deal with it. And certainly it's also a very short cycle because most VAT returns are filed either on a monthly or bi-monthly basis. So the downfall of it, of course, is that it tracks essentially spend. So any reduction in spend immediately has an impact in your revenue collections as well.
Sure.
And SARS has been extremely effective at rooting out, at least at the larger scale, things such as fraud and VAT fraud because of the mechanisms there, and it's a lot easier to test and audit and to verify. Sure. But I think your biggest pool other than VAT is your personal income tax in terms of collections. And you're saying as well, you know, the collection model, we must just remember that the SARS of today is very different from the SARS it was before, and not necessarily in the changes of leadership or politics or those things. Yeah. It's also, as we evolve, the Revenue Authority also has to evolve.
Okay, yeah.
So at the moment the Revenue Authority is very much about making their collection targets. So their core driver is collection. Yeah. Where the Revenue Office that we had when it was still Pravin, when he took that role, taking us out from receiver of revenue to South African Revenue Service, his focus was modernization, training. A lot of those things were core drivers, and the tax collections would follow. Sure. Which is very different from what today is. Now, remember, as we increase taxes, as tax morality reduces, it makes it more difficult for SARS to collect those. And then when SARS starts flexing those muscles to collect it, then we become even more anti-SARS because they're flexing those muscles. Now, I'm not saying SARS is doing everything right. There are issues. But I think the mechanisms are there to address those. Sure. We recently saw, for instance, the Tax Ombuds Office that was appointed to address things like VAT refunds issues. Yeah. And I think
complaints that were coming from there.
And I think the next evolution is that we're now starting to see that it's not just individual complaints, but rather systematic review of that, which now can fill through to the Revenue Office, where they can now improve those. So I think there is a need for further evolution in the tax office, but I think the mechanisms to facilitate that is definitely there.
If I had time, I was going to ask you if you think the leadership that's there is capable of introducing those things, but we're running out of time. So let's hear from the man himself. I mean, when Cyril Ramaphosa came in, he delivered the State of the Nation address, and I remember there was a lot of praise for the points that he raised. Let's listen to a few.
New President Cyril Ramaphosa has his plate full of promises after the State of the Nation address. He needs to get land for the people. He's prepared to take it without compensation, a move unlikely to be popular with investors. Then there's free higher education. Jacob Zuma dropped it on him just before he left power. Now he's got to make it happen. Jobs. South Africa has a 26% unemployment rate. Ramaphosa says he has a plan. Government ministries, there are too many, and Ramaphosa promised to cut them down to save money. State-owned enterprises, a way has to be found to stop them from losing taxpayers' money. State capture, a commission of inquiry is to investigate corruption as soon as possible.
Now, this budget will also be under immense pressure to cut down the number of government ministries to save money. New President Cyril Ramaphosa hinted at it last week in his State of the Nation address. The number of ministries has grown steadily, as at a vast cost to the taxpayer since 1994. Let's take a look at how much they have grown.
One of the expenses new President Cyril Ramaphosa has vowed to cut down is the bloated cost of government ministries. The country started out at the dawn of democracy in 1994 with just under 20 ministries under Nelson Mandela. Thabo Mbeki increased this to 26 in 1999. Then Jacob Zuma's years saw the cabinet increase to 35 ministries with 37 deputies. This cost the taxpayer a staggering 720 million rand a year, which is equivalent to $61.3 million. The opposition is calling for a major cutback in the next budget.
So we've been talking about what the government can do in terms of increasing the taxes. But I think the other side of it, of course, is that the government can also do something about reducing the amount of money that it spends. So I want to put this question to my guest. Prof, can I start with you? In terms of government wiggle room, how much space does the minister have? What do you guys call it? Fiscal space?
Yes, the government will have to create the fiscal space, Godfrey. For one, we've just seen in the insert, cutting the number of ministries, deputy ministers, etc. We can save 750 million rands a year just on ministries. That's the minister, the deputy minister, the staff, etc. We cut the cabinet from 37 to 22. On a lighter note, I must really confess that I always had this feeling that Mr. Zuma never knew the name of all the ministers, the names of all the deputy ministers, and the names of all the ministries.
Do you have evidence?
I have no evidence, but there were just too many. And I think we can run a little competition to see whether any South African would know them other than the Speaker of Parliament. Be that as may, I have made my example already of the vehicles for the government fleet that can be cut immediately with very good effect. At the same time, the government should take the bold step and put a moratorium on civil service employment. We employ about 1.3, 1.4 million civil servants at the moment. There should be a moratorium. And then, of course, there should be restraint on civil service remuneration adjustments. When I say this on air, I might have trouble going home tonight. My wife is a civil servant. So let me just state my vested interest. But the civil service remuneration bill should, in my view, be capped at not more than, at the outmost, 5% growth.
I don't know how much football you watch, but when George Weah came and became president of of Liberia, he cut his salary. I can't remember the percentage. I think it was 25% or something like that. Would a gesture like that, imposed on all the government ministers, send a clear message to the private sector and to the civil servants themselves that perhaps this is the way to go, that we need, instead of actually thinking that we can only increase and get more taxes in, we can actually do something about the amount of money that we're spending. I've already made you talk. Annabel.
Look, I think certainly, your three components of expenditure, your social welfare, your remuneration employees, and obviously interest on debt. I'd certainly look at the interest on debt as a key area where I think we need to cut down by cutting down on our debt projections, because the escalation that we saw previously, they produced a number of scenarios, was so scary, it is such a major jump up that it actually in itself would result in a debt trap, a very worrying type of outcome. So I think that that's something they need to look at quite carefully.
Your competitors at FNB, I was just sorry to interrupt you, I was just looking at the number that they have got on those expenditure items, and the fastest growing component on that front is the 14.9% increase in debt service costs.
That's the point I want to make. It didn't used to be the fastest growing item, but it has become the fastest growing item. And it's very it's self-fulfilling. The faster it grows, the faster it will grow. You know what I'm trying to say? Because the big issue is we don't want to borrow to pay off debt. We want to borrow to actually pay for infrastructure, and our current expenditure, our revenue that is derived from taxes, not from debt, that should then be used to pay for current expenditure. But talking about expenditure itself, what we can relook at, I certainly think what needs to be done now is a close look at provision of services to government, tenders. Obviously, we've talked about corruption, the need to look at that quite closely, but now to actually look at them in a very substantial way in terms of what is the most cost-effective way, how can we save the most money, and really have a cost-saving drive in not looking at the top level of government only, but also looking right across the board, your municipalities, your provincial levels, on a consolidated basis, to try and actually streamline and make it most efficient. And then, of course, talking about the remuneration component to obviously streamline that as well. You know, I'm not of the view that we need to look at expenditure cuts in terms of your lower paid civil servants. You know, I certainly wouldn't want that coming through, you know, in terms of teachers, police, etc. But in terms of your upper echelons of civil servants, you know, if you're going to not give any release for fiscal drag in the middle to upper income levels, you should look at the same thing for your ministers. And for the upper certainly echelons of civil servants remuneration, and should they actually be getting increases, any increases at all, given that we actually are quite close to facing what could become, you know, the need for austerity in South Africa if this deterioration in fiscal the government finances persists, if it is not obviously reeled back and we manage to make the changes we need to do now urgently.
Absolutely. Cyril?
So trying to get the government size down, I don't think we're probably going to be, we want that to happen, but I don't think in the short term we would be able to achieve it.
Why
given
not?
The fact that it would create such instability. I mean, when
tell me, explain it to me. What kind of instability? Are you saying the fired people are going to riot in the street?
Well, firstly, we've had the wage bill started rising sometime around 2011. In the education sector, for example, SART was at the center of that.
Sure.
I mean, there are claims right now that unions are running some of the government departments. So you can imagine when Treasury tries to come in and cut wages of those civil servants, what
ahead of an election,
what wreck they can cause. So I don't think it's likely that we're going to have lots of cuts there, even though probably that's the right way to go. I think over time we can do it gradually, just as long as, like I said earlier on, because the budget is really about making sure political stability remains.
Sure. Ettiene?
Look, I think when you look at a budget, and if we simplify it, there's essentially your three items: is what comes in, what I spend it on, and then how much I have left or how much I have to borrow.
Yeah.
And I think, like any budget, to balance it, I have to say, well, if I don't have surpluses, I need to reprioritize my spend to the most important. And often with reprioritization is saying as well, if I've got to borrow, I've got to make sure what I borrow is for longer term purposes. So I agree with the borrowing that we have must be towards infrastructural spend and not to just keep the lights on and to service the debt that we have, because that becomes an unmanageable circumstance.
Yeah. And the numbers are not encouraging on that front.
Correct.
Because the figure I was looking at, it looks like capital expenditures around 4% growth, I think.
Correct. And we can only go that far with increasing taxes, and that's the income. So the reality is that unless we start pushing taxes to such a position where it almost becomes an unmanageable circumstance, the only other alternative is really that expenditure cut. The problem is that we've got to be clever of that about that expenditure cut. We can't just choose to arbitrarily cut. Yeah. It's essentially, I would rather say, rather than using the word cut, I'd rather say reprioritizing.
Right. We
have to reprioritize when and where we want to spend the money.
Okay. I'm being told now, right now we can see the Minister of Finance, and it is Malusi Gigaba walking in to deliver that budget statement, and we're hoping shortly that we'll have some of the details of what the Minister is going to be telling the House and how he intends to spend that money. I am hoping still that we'll be able to bring you what that number is likely to be, if it is indeed going to come through in this instance. We cannot go away without having talked about the goats, or shall we call them the lions or the mice in the room, the state-owned enterprises. If Minister Gigaba decides not to spend another 10 billion rand on South African Airways, with money that we could potentially put back into that budget.
In short, Godfrey, the government should give SAA away. There's no reason to own
You mean like for $1, or sorry, for a rand?
Yeah, just give it away. It has no value.
It's worthless anyway.
Yes. Just get it out of the accounts of the government and save taxpayers that expenditure.
Is privatization the way to go, Annabel?
I think certainly we've seen hinted in the SONA of partial privatization, incremental privatization. I think it is quite hard for some to actually stomach in the party. You know, historically they've tended more towards a nationalization view. But I think that realistically, and if you look at global success stories, privatization is the way to go. You know, if you look at Australia, for example, they've got phenomenally low government debt. because they're privatised.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, the key issue for South Africa is we don't have to do it in one big go and upset the apple cart, but I think certainly now the time has come where we have to look realistically at what benefits do privatisation bring. And that analysis has not, I think, been made in the private domain, in the public domain, sorry. I think that, you know, privatisation has been seen as a big negative by many people without bothering to unpack it politically and work out what are the big gains that we can actually make and how can that money be better spent elsewhere to lift growth and
Maybe
employment.
that's another discussion that we need to have, because the question I was going to ask you, Cyril, is can a former trade unionist who made billions and became very rich indeed introduce privatization? I was speaking to the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa yesterday, and the language that was being used, absolutely, I can see any mention of the word privatization being made by protests in the streets. Well, can he do it? Does he have the political will or political capital?
No, capital probably not, but will maybe, and mental capacity probably. I mean, SOEs are probably one of the blocks that we have that are stifling our growth. SAA is a big burden, like many of the other enterprises. So for me, going the route of putting them out there, I mean, competing with Come, competing with Sane, all the airlines that went under, because SAA is being funded by us taxpayers, and therefore at the end of the day it's consumers who suffer. Rationally it makes sense to get rid of some of these enterprises. So would he do it? Yeah, political climate probably right now would not allow him.
Yeah, I was going to ask if there are any takers for SAA, but Ettiene?
Well, I think first of all, whenever you've got state-owned enterprise, you immediately remove the competitive element from it, and it's almost accepted that anti-competitive behavior can be rife, and I think just in any business, your driver is operational efficiency. When you are backed by the government and you know that they always have to back you, then there's no drive for operational efficiency. And I think just on that point alone, you can put all the plans you want to in place to say, how can I revive it? But without that competitive drive, without the need to be operationally efficient, you're not going to have that to happen effectively. And I think for that reason, I think the only way for this to work would be privatization.
Privatization is the way to go. Will it happen, do you think, before the next elections, or to potentially see perhaps in Cyril's first term? I'm not discounting the Democratic Alliance, sorry.
I think the first step is that this is not something that could happen overnight. It will have to happen progressively. There's going to have to be a lot of consultation that has to take place in that process. There's many, and again, that retaliation that we can expect from parties will only be addressed by proper consultation. So I think a lot of consultation process come into it, and that does take time. And yes, we do have an election around the corner, and it's not going to be a very popular thing to do. So my prediction would be is that we can only hope to truly have those conversations after the next elections. Yeah,
and we've already seen that Cyril Ramaphosa as president is not going to be making any quick decisions. We're told, everybody was saying there's going to be a cabinet reshuffle, and he says, nah, this is going to take months, and I'm going to do lifestyle audits, and then after that, I'll then see what I need to do based on evidence. Gentlemen, lady, thank you very much indeed. Let me thank my guests, Professor Jannie, Rossouw, Head of School of Economic and Business Science at Wits University. Thank you, sir, for coming through. Annabel Bishop, Chief Economist, Investec, thank you. Cyril, thank you. Ettiene, thank you very much.